The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door like a thief in the night, its edges crumpled as if ashamed of its own words. Martin Reed, 62, stood frozen in his modest Seattle living room, the paper trembling in his calloused hands. It wasn't the eviction notice he feared, it was the signature at the bottom, his son Caleb. Martin's partner, Javier, stirred coffee in the kitchen, oblivious to the storm brewing in Martin's chest. 30 years ago, Martin had come out to his family, losing his parents' approval but gaining Javier's unwavering love. Now, at an age when most men rested easy, Martin faced a betrayal that cut deeper than any rejection. Caleb, his only child, had drained his pension fund, every cent he'd saved for a quiet retirement with Javier, to fund a life with a woman who spat venom at their very existence. The Seattle evening hummed outside, the city's drizzle painting the windows in streaks. Martin's knees buckled, and he sank onto the worn couch, the letter slipping to the floor. Javier's footsteps approached, soft and steady, but Martin couldn't meet his gaze. "What's wrong, Amor?" Javier asked, his voice a warm anchor in the chaos. Martin handed him the letter, his throat too tight to speak. Javier's brown eyes scanned the page, and his face hardened, not with anger, but with the kind of sorrow that comes from loving someone through their worst mistakes. Caleb's words were clinical, detached. "I needed the money, Dad. Lauren and I are starting fresh. You'll manage. No apology, no regret. Just a son who'd chosen a woman who called Martin's love for Javier's sin. A woman who'd convinced Caleb to erase his father's future for her own. Martin had raised Caleb alone after his wife left, pouring every ounce of himself into being both parents. He'd cheered at soccer games, bandaged scraped knees, and stayed up late teaching Caleb how to dream big. And now this. Javier knelt beside him, his hand warm on Martin's knee. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady despite the crack in his eyes. "We always do." But Martin wasn't so sure. The pension was their lifeline, meant for medical bills, a small cabin in the Cascades, maybe even a trip to Javier's hometown in Mexico. Without it, their modest life teetered on the edge of ruin. Across town, in a cramped apartment filled with the scent of cheap perfume and ambition, Caleb sat with Lauren. She was all sharp edges and sharper words, her blonde hair pulled tight in a bun that mirrored her control over him. "It's for us," she'd said when she convinced him to take the money. "Your dad's old. He doesn't need it like we do." Caleb had nodded, ignoring the knot in his gut, because Lauren's vision of their future, a big house, a perfect life, felt like the redemption he'd been chasing since his mom walked out. He didn't see the irony, trading one family's love for another's approval. But someone else saw it. Ethan, Caleb's 16-year-old son, Martin's grandson, had overheard everything. He sat in his room, headphones dangling around his neck, his notebook filled with sketches of the grandfather he adored, the man who'd taught him to fish, to laugh, to stand tall despite the world's judgment. Ethan's dark eyes burned with a fire his father had long since lost. He'd grown up watching Martin and Javier's love, a quiet strength that made him proud, not ashamed. And now, his father had betrayed them. Ethan slipped out of the apartment, his sneakers pounding the wet pavement as he headed for the bus to Martin's house. He didn't have a plan, just a heart full of fury and a need to make things right. The city blurred past, neon signs, honking cars, the pulse of a world that didn't stop for broken families. By the time he reached Martin's doorstep, his breath was ragged, but his resolve was iron. "Grandpa," Ethan said, bursting through the door. Martin looked up, startled, his face a map of worry. Javier stood behind him, a silent pillar. "I know what Dad did," Ethan said, his voice cracking, "and I'm not letting him get away with it." Martin's heart twisted. Ethan was so young, too young to carry this weight. But the boy's eyes held a determination that reminded Martin of himself decades ago, when he'd chosen love over fear. "Ethan, this isn't your fight," Martin said softly. "It is," Ethan shot back. "You're my family. Both of you. He glanced at Javier, who offered a small, grateful nod. I'm going to fix this. I promise. That night, as Martin and Javier lay in bed, the weight of Caleb's betrayal hung heavy. But Ethan's words sparked something, a flicker of hope in a story that felt like it was spiraling toward despair. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in hours, Martin felt a warmth in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, family could be rebuilt, not through the son who turned away, but through the grandson who refused to let go. Ethan's sneakers left faint prints on the damp sidewalk as he walked back to his apartment, the Seattle night wrapping around him like a heavy coat. His mind raced, replaying the hurt in his grandfather's eyes, the way Javier's hand lingered on Martin's shoulder, steadying him. Ethan wasn't just angry at his dad. He was furious at himself for not seeing it sooner, for not stopping Caleb before he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Back at home, the apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that screamed of secrets. Lauren was out, probably at one of her community meetings, where she'd preach about family values while tearing Ethan's apart. Caleb sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing in his son. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice low but sharp. Caleb looked up, startled, his face a mix of guilt and defiance. "What's up, buddy?" Caleb asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan didn't sit. He stood, arms crossed, his notebook tucked under one elbow. "I know what you did to Grandpa. You stole his money. For her." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Caleb's smile faltered, his fingers tightening around the phone. "It's not that simple, Ethan," Caleb said, his voice strained. "Lauren and we're building something. A future. Your grandpa's fine. He's got Javier at the house. He's got nothing." Ethan snapped, his voice rising. "You took everything he worked for. You think that's okay because Lauren says it is? She hates him, Dad. She hates who he is." Caleb stood, his face reddening. "You don't understand, Ethan. You're too young. This is about providing for us. You, me, Lauren. Your grandpa's tough. He'll bounce back." Ethan's jaw clenched. He wanted to scream, to shake his dad until he saw the damage he'd caused. Instead, he turned and walked to his room, slamming the door. He couldn't change Caleb, not yet. But he could do something. He opened his notebook, its pages filled with sketches and dreams, and started writing. A plan, a way to make things right. Meanwhile, Martin and Javier sat at their kitchen table, the eviction notice now joined by a stack of bills. The pension wasn't just money. It was their safety net, their dream of a life unburdened by the world's judgment. Javier traced circles on Martin's hand, his touch a reminder of the vows they'd made, not in a church but in their hearts. "We could sell the house," Javier said quietly. "Start over somewhere smaller." Martin shook his head. "This is our home, Javi. We built it. Caleb doesn't get to take that too." His voice cracked, and Javier pulled him close, their foreheads touching. They'd faced worse. Hate crimes in the 90s, family rejection, the AIDS crisis that took too many friends. But this betrayal, from Martin's own blood, felt like a wound that wouldn't close. Across town, Ethan's plan took shape. He'd always been resourceful, piecing together art projects from scraps, teaching himself to code from library books. Now he turned that ingenuity to a bigger cause. He knew Caleb had transferred the pension money to a joint account with Lauren, but Ethan had grown up watching his dad's carelessness with passwords. A few clicks on Caleb's laptop, left open on the couch, confirmed the account details. Ethan wasn't a thief. He wouldn't touch the money, but he could expose it. He started small, digging into Lauren's so-called community group. Her online presence was loud, filled with posts about traditional values and fundraisers for causes that vilified people like Martin and Javier. Ethan's stomach churned as he read her words, but he kept going, compiling screenshots, bank statements, anything that showed where the money had gone. He didn't know how he'd use it yet, but he knew it mattered. The next morning, Ethan skipped school and took the bus to the local community center, a place where Martin had once volunteered, teaching art to kids like him. The center was a haven for Seattle's LGBTQ plus community, a patchwork of pride flags and warm faces. Ethan found Ms. Harper, the director, a woman with a sharp bob and sharper wit who'd known Martin for decades. "Ethan," she said, her eyes softening. "What's going on?" He spilled everything. The letter, the pension, Lauren's influence. Ms. Harper listened, her face a mix of fury and sorrow. "Your grandpa's one of the good ones," she said. "We'll help. But this is big, Ethan. Legal. Messy." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not letting them lose everything." Ms. Harper nodded, pulling out her phone. "Let's start by talking to a lawyer. Someone who owes Martin a favor." She paused, studying Ethan. "You're a lot like him, you know. Stubborn. Heart bigger than your head." Ethan smiled for the first time in days. He didn't feel like a hero, just a kid who loved his grandpas. But as he left the center, notebook clutched tight, he felt the weight of possibility. Caleb had made a choice, but so had Ethan, and his choice was to fight. The lawyer's office smelled of old books and coffee, a cramped space tucked above a Seattle bookstore. Ethan sat across from Ms. Torres, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who'd agreed to meet because of Ms. Harper's call. His notebook lay open on the desk, pages filled with evidence. Bank transfers, Lauren's posts, even a timeline of Caleb's betrayal. Ms. Torres leaned forward, her glasses catching the dim light. "This is serious, Ethan," she said. "Fraud, theft, maybe even elder abuse. But your dad. You sure you want to go down this road?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "He's my dad, but Martin and Javier are my family. They don't deserve this." Ms. Torres studied him, then jotted a note. "All right," she said. "We start with a freeze on the account. Then we build a case." Back at Martin's house, the air felt heavier each day. The eviction notice loomed, a countdown to losing the home where they'd laughed, fought, loved. Javier tried to keep things light, cooking Martin's favorite pozole, but even the warmth of the kitchen couldn't thaw the chill in Martin's heart. He'd stopped sleeping, his mind replaying every moment with Caleb, every sacrifice, every hope, wondering where he'd gone wrong. Javier noticed the change. Late one night, as rain tapped the windows, he found Martin staring at old photos. Caleb, as a toddler, grinning with a soccer ball. Martin and Javier at their commitment ceremony, eyes bright with defiance. "You didn't fail him," Javier said, sitting beside him. "He failed himself." Martin's voice was barely a whisper. "I just wanted him to be happy, Javi, even if he hated who I am." Javier took his hand, his grip firm. "He doesn't hate you. He's lost. And we're not giving up, not on him, not on us." Martin leaned into him, drawing strength from a man who'd been his home for decades. Meanwhile, Ethan's plan gained momentum. Ms. Torres filed an emergency motion to freeze Caleb's account, citing unauthorized access to Martin's pension. It wasn't a fix, but stopped Lauren from spending more. Ethan spent his evenings at the community center, rallying support. Volunteers, artists, activists, neighbors who'd known Martin for years, offered to help. They started a crowdfunding campaign, Save Martin's Home, sharing stories of his kindness, teaching kids to paint, volunteering at shelters, loving Javier fiercely in a world that often looked away. The campaign spread online, catching the attention of local news. A reporter, intrigued by the story of a gay couple betrayed by their son, reached out for an interview. Martin hesitated, but Javier convinced him. "Let the world see who we are," Javier said. "Let them see what Caleb's throwing away." The interview aired on a rainy Thursday, Martin and Javier sitting side by side on their couch, hands clasped. Martin spoke quietly, his voice raw but steady, about raising Caleb alone, about building a life with Javier despite the odds. Javier's eyes shone as he added, "Love doesn't make us weak. It's why we're still here." The segment ended with a plea for support, and donations poured in. Not enough to replace the pension, but enough to buy time. Caleb saw the broadcast. He sat in Lauren's apartment, her voice shrill in the background as she ranted about public shaming. But Caleb wasn't listening. He saw his dad's face, the lines deeper than he remembered, and something cracked inside him. For the first time, he wondered if Lauren's vision of their future was worth the cost. Ethan, meanwhile, wasn't done. He'd found Lauren's fundraiser records, showing she'd funneled Martin's money into her group's anti-LGBTQ+ campaigns. He shared the evidence with Ms. Torres, who called it a gold mine. But Ethan's heart wasn't in the legal fight. It was with Martin and Javier. He visited them daily, bringing sketches to cheer them up, helping Javier cook, listening to Martin's stories about the 80s, when being out meant risking everything. One evening, as they sat around the table, Martin looked at Ethan, his eyes soft. "You're too young for this fight, kid," he said. Ethan shook his head. "I'm not fighting for you, Grandpa. I'm fighting with you." Javier laughed, a sound that filled the room with light, and for a moment, the weight lifted. But the storm wasn't over. Lauren, enraged by the frozen account and public backlash, confronted Caleb. "You're letting your kid ruin us," she shouted, her face twisted. Caleb, for the first time, didn't nod along. He thought of Ethan's defiance, of Martin's quiet strength, and wondered if he'd chosen the wrong side. Caleb's world was unraveling. Lauren's apartment, once a haven of promises, felt like a cage. Her voice grated as she paced, blaming Ethan, Martin, even Javier for the frozen account and the growing scrutiny on her fundraisers. "They're making me the villain," she snapped, tossing her phone onto the couch. Caleb stared at the floor, the weight of his choices pressing down. He'd wanted a fresh start, a family that felt normal after years of feeling like the odd one out. But now, normal felt like a lie. Across town, Ethan sat at the community center, surrounded by volunteers sorting donations, blankets, canned goods, cash from Martin and Javier's bills. The crowdfunding campaign had raised enough to cover 2 months' rent, but the pension case was still tied up in court. Ms. Torres warned it could take months, maybe years, to recover the money. Ethan refused to accept that. He'd started digging deeper, using skills he'd picked up from online forums to trace Lauren's financial trail. What he found made his blood run cold. She'd redirected funds to an offshore account, out of reach. Ethan shared the discovery with Ms. Torres, who cursed under her breath. "This changes things," she said. "It's not just theft now. It's potential fraud across state lines." She promised to escalate the case, but Ethan felt the clock ticking. Martin and Javier were holding on, but the stress was etching new lines into their faces. Ethan couldn't let them lose their home. At Martin's house, the couple faced another blow, a second eviction notice, this one with a shorter deadline. The landlord, sympathetic but firm, couldn't wait forever. Javier tried to keep Martin's spirits up, dragging him to the community center for a painting night. The room buzzed with laughter, kids splashing colors on canvases, but Martin's brush moved slowly, his heart elsewhere. Javier watched him, his own chest tight. He'd always been the optimist, but even he felt the strain. Ethan arrived, his energy a spark in the dim room. He showed Martin a sketch, a portrait of him and Javier, hands clasped, standing under a rainbow flag. "This is who you are," Ethan said, his voice fierce. "Dad can't take that away." Martin's eyes welled up, and he pulled Ethan into a hug. "You're saving us, kid," he whispered. Ethan shook his head. "You saved me first." The next day, Caleb showed up at Martin's house, unannounced. Martin opened the door, his face a mix of hope and wariness. Caleb looked smaller, his shoulders hunched, eyes red. "Dad," he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. Javier appeared behind Martin, his presence steady but guarded. "Can we talk?" Caleb asked. They sat in the living room, the same couch where Martin had read the letter that shattered him. Caleb's words came haltingly. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "Lauren, she made it sound like we were building something good. I thought I was fixing my life." Martin's voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't fix your life, Caleb. You broke mine." The words cut, and Caleb flinched. Javier stayed silent, his hand on Martin's knee, a silent reminder of their shared strength. "I want to make it right," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how." Martin looked at his son, seeing the boy he'd raised beneath the man who'd betrayed him. "Start by being honest," he said. "With me, with Ethan, with yourself." Caleb left, promising to try, but Martin wasn't sure he believed him. Javier, ever the optimist, squeezed his hand. "He's still your son," he said, "and Ethan's still his." Ethan, meanwhile, was relentless. He'd connected with a hacker collective online, ethical coders who exposed fraud. With Ms. Torres's guidance, they traced Lauren's offshore account, linking it to her group's shady dealings. The evidence was damning, and Ms. Torres filed a new motion, this time with federal implications. Ethan felt a surge of hope, but also fear. Confronting Lauren meant confronting his dad, and he wasn't sure Caleb was ready to face the truth. That night, Ethan sat with Martin and Javier, sharing takeout pizza. The house felt warmer, filled with laughter despite the looming deadline. Ethan told stories of school, of his art, of the community rallying behind them. Martin listened, his heart swelling. Caleb had taken so much, but Ethan was giving it back. Not just money, but hope, family, love. As they cleared the plates, the doorbell rang. Ethan opened it, expecting a neighbor, but found Caleb standing there, his face pale. "I need your help," Caleb said, his eyes on Ethan. "I'm done with Lauren, but she's not going to let go easy." Caleb's words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between betrayal and redemption. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. Martin and Javier stepped forward, their faces a mix of shock and cautious hope. "Come in," Martin said, his voice steady but laced with years of hurt. Caleb shuffled inside, avoiding their eyes, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The living room felt smaller with all four of them there. Martin, Javier, Ethan, and the ghost of Caleb's mistakes. Caleb sat on the edge of the couch, his knees bouncing. "Lauren's out of control," he said. "She's moving the money again, hiding it. I didn't know how deep this went until now." He looked at Ethan, his voice cracking. "You were right, kid. I messed up." Ethan's fists clenched. Part of him wanted to shout, to demand why Caleb hadn't seen it sooner. But another part, the part that remembered his dad teaching him to ride a bike, cheering at his art shows, softened. "What do you need?" Ethan asked, his tone guarded. Caleb explained. Lauren had locked him out of their accounts, but he knew her patterns, her passwords. He'd seen her transfer funds late at night, whispering on calls with her group's leaders. "If we can get proof," Caleb said, "maybe we can stop her. Get the money back." Martin's eyes narrowed. "Why now, Caleb? Why help us after what you did?" Caleb's shoulders sagged. "Because I see it now, Dad. I see you. I see Ethan." He paused, his voice breaking. "I see what I threw away." Javier's hand tightened on Martin's, a silent plea to listen. Martin nodded, but his heart stayed guarded. Ethan took charge. "We need to move fast," he said, pulling out his notebook. He'd been working with the hacker collective, and with Caleb's insider knowledge, they could pinpoint Lauren's transactions. Ms. Torres was looped in, her voice crackling over a late-night call. "If Caleb's willing to testify," she said, "we've got a real shot." The next day, Ethan and Caleb met at the community center, a neutral ground where Caleb wouldn't feel judged. Volunteers bustled around, preparing for a pride event, their energy a stark contrast to the tension between father and son. Ethan showed Caleb the evidence he'd gathered, screenshots, bank records, Lauren's own words condemning people like Martin and Javier. Caleb's face paled as he read, the reality of his choices sinking in. "I didn't know she was this bad," Caleb muttered, rubbing his temples. "I thought she just disagreed." "She didn't just disagree," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "She used you. She used Grandpa's money to hurt people like him." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight, and for the first time, Ethan saw something in his dad he hadn't seen in years, shame. They worked late, Ethan guiding Caleb through the technical steps to access Lauren's accounts legally, with Ms. Torres overseeing every move. By midnight, they had it, proof of transfers to an offshore account tied to Lauren's group. Ms. Torres filed an emergency injunction, halting any further movement of funds. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step. At Martin's house, The mood was cautiously optimistic. Javier cooked, filling the air with the scent of mole, while Martin sorted through old letters, trying to make sense of his son's return. Ethan arrived, exhausted but determined, and shared the update. "Caleb's helping," he said. "He's trying." Martin's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. "Trying isn't enough, Ethan." "Not yet." Javier touched his arm, a gentle reminder of grace, but Martin's heart still ached. He wanted to believe in Caleb, but trust was a fragile thing, broken by years of distance and one devastating choice. The Pride event arrived, a burst of color and music at the community center. Martin and Javier stood together, hands clasped, as Ethan helped set up a booth for the crowdfunding campaign. The community rallied, neighbors, friends, strangers who'd seen the news story, offering hugs, donations, words of support. Martin felt a warmth he hadn't in months, a reminder that family wasn't just blood. It was the people who showed up. Caleb appeared at the edge of the crowd, hesitant. Ethan spotted him and waved him over, ignoring the curious stares. "You came," Ethan said, a mix of surprise and hope in his voice. Caleb nodded, his eyes on Martin and Javier, who were laughing with a group of kids painting rainbow flags. For a moment, Caleb saw his dad not as a symbol of his own failures, but as a man who'd built a life worth fighting for. As the event wound down, Caleb approached Martin. "I'm sorry," he said, the words raw and unpracticed. "I know it's not enough, but I'm here. I want to fix this." Martin looked at his son, seeing the boy he'd once known, and nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a start. The courtroom was cold, sterile, a far cry from the warmth of the Pride event. Martin sat in the front row, Javier's hand steady in his, as Ms. Torres presented their case. Ethan sat behind them, his notebook now a legal exhibit, its pages a testament to his determination. Caleb was there too, on the witness stand, his voice shaky but clear as he detailed Lauren's scheme, how she'd manipulated him, how she'd siphoned Martin's pension for her group's agenda. Lauren sat across the room, her face a mask of defiance. Her lawyer argued she'd acted in good faith, that the money was a gift from Caleb. But Ms. Torres was relentless, presenting bank records, screenshots, Caleb's testimony. The judge, a stern woman with kind eyes, listened intently, her gavel a quiet threat. Outside, Seattle buzzed with autumn energy, leaves falling like secrets. The community had rallied, the crowdfunding campaign, now a local movement. Strangers sent letters, shared Martin and Javier's story online, called them heroes. Martin didn't feel heroic, just tired and hopeful, in a way he hadn't dared to be in months. Ethan watched his dad on the stand, a mix of pride and pain in his chest. Caleb's testimony was a turning point, but it didn't erase the hurt. After the hearing, Ethan found Caleb outside, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "You did good in there," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. Caleb exhaled, the smoke curling into the gray sky. "I don't know if it's enough," he said. "It's a start," Ethan replied, echoing Martin's words. He handed Caleb a sketch, a portrait of the four of them, imagined as a family, whole again. Caleb's eyes welled up, and he pulled Ethan into a hug, the first in years that felt real. Back at home, Martin and Javier faced a new challenge. The landlord's deadline was days away, and the court case, though promising, wouldn't resolve in time. The community center stepped in, organizing a final push, a benefit concert to cover the rent. Ethan helped plan it, his energy infectious. He recruited local bands, artists, even a drag queen who'd known Martin since the 80s. The event was set for Saturday, a celebration of love and resilience. The night of the concert, the community center overflowed. Martin and Javier stood at the back, watching as Ethan took the stage, his voice steady as he spoke about his grandpas. "They taught me what love looks like," he said, his eyes shining. "Not just for each other, but for everyone. That's worth fighting for." The crowd cheered, and Martin felt Javier's hand tighten in his, a silent vow. Caleb was there, in the shadows, watching his son shine. He'd spent the day moving out of Lauren's apartment, his belongings in a single duffel bag. He hadn't spoken to her since the hearing, her venomous calls left unanswered. For the first time, he felt free, not of guilt, but of her control. The concert raised enough to pay the rent, and then some. Volunteers passed around donation jars, and a local business owner pledged to match funds. Martin and Javier danced to a slow song, their bodies swaying in the crowd, and for a moment, the world felt right. Ethan joined them, his laughter bright, and even Caleb stepped closer, hesitant but present. After the concert, Ms. Torres called with news. The judge had ruled in their favor. Lauren's accounts were frozen, her group under investigation. The pension money wasn't back yet, but the path was clear. Martin exhaled, the weight lifting just enough to breathe. Javier kissed his forehead, whispering, "We made it, amor." But the victory wasn't just legal. It was Ethan standing tall. It was Caleb trying to rebuild. It was the community wrapping them in love when blood had failed. Martin looked at his family, fractured, flawed, but fighting, and felt something stronger than loss: hope. Months later, the Seattle air carried the crisp promise of winter. Martin and Javier's house stood firm, no longer under threat, thanks to the community's support and the slow return of the pension funds. The court case had unraveled Lauren's schemes. Her group disbanded under scrutiny, her influence a fading shadow. Caleb had cut ties completely, renting a small apartment and starting therapy to untangle years of bad choices. He wasn't forgiven, not fully, but he was trying, showing up for Ethan, for Martin, for himself. Ethan, now 17, had changed. His notebook, once a private escape, was now a portfolio, his art featured in a local gallery show. He'd started a youth group at the community center, a space for kids like him to find strength in their identities, their families, their dreams. Martin and Javier volunteered there, teaching art, sharing stories, their love a beacon for those still searching. One Sunday, the four of them gathered at Martin's house for dinner. It was awkward at first, the silence heavy with unspoken hurts. But Javier's laughter broke the tension, his stories of Mexico filling the room with warmth. Ethan showed Caleb his latest sketch, a mural designed for the community center, a vibrant tribute to chosen family. Caleb's eyes lingered on it, a quiet pride in his son's talent. Martin watched them, his heart a mix of ache and gratitude. Caleb had broken something sacred, but Ethan had rebuilt it, piece by piece. "I'm proud of you," Martin said to Ethan, his voice soft. Then, after a pause, he looked at Caleb. "And I'm trying to be proud of you, too." Caleb nodded, his throat tight. "I'll keep earning it, Dad." It wasn't a promise of perfection, but it was honest, and for now, that was enough. As they cleared the table, Ethan pulled out his phone, showing a video from the Pride event, a montage of the concert, the crowd, Martin and Javier dancing. "This is us," Ethan said, his voice steady. "This is what we fought for." Martin felt tears prick his eyes, not from pain, but from the weight of love, of Javier's hand in his, of Ethan's fierce heart, of Caleb's tentative steps back. The night ended with coffee on the porch, the city lights twinkling below. Martin leaned against Javier, Ethan beside them, Caleb a step away but closer than he'd been in years. The road to healing was long, but they were walking it together. Ethan's fight had saved more than a house. It had saved a family, not the one they'd started with, but the one they'd chosen to become. In the quiet, Martin thought of the letter that started it all, now tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of how far they'd come. He looked at Ethan, his grandson, the boy who dropped to his knees not in defeat but in determination, and knew this was the legacy that mattered. Love, fought for, won, and shared.